All right, so we're going to talk about stroke prevention here. We have a couple lectures. So the first part of this lecture is really the why, like what is really the what or why we have stroke and Alzheimer's disease and what the processes are involved in that. So the first hour, we're going to talk about the different processes that contribute to cerebrovascular disease, which include Alzheimer's disease and stroke. And the second hour, we're going to go through specific nutritional strategies to prevent that. So really, we have different objectives here. And first, we're going to discuss why stroke, myocardial infarction, and Alzheimer's have the same common risk factors and understand that these common risk factors are related to inflammation, oxidative stress, and advanced glycation end products. That's what AGE stands for here. And state why inflammation is the causative agent for most, if not all, of our degenerative diseases. Describe free radicals and oxidative stress, discuss mitochondrial degradation, and discuss antioxidants. In addition, we're going to discuss what all the neurodegenerative diseases have in common, discuss Alzheimer's disease, discuss the role of inflammation in Alzheimer's disease and stroke, discuss the anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties of certain herbs such as curcumin and turmeric, state the modifiable risk factors for stroke, discuss the dietary role of fat, salt, and sugar in the development of hypertension and diabetes type 2 and other risk factors associated with stroke, and describe how the constituents of a plant-based diet can prevent Alzheimer's disease and stroke. So when we talk about prevention for stroke and Alzheimer's disease, there's multiple different things we're going to be talking about. But before we go into all these details, let me just tell you what we're all about here. Our organization is called Stroke Busters. We're a nonprofit 501c3 organization. That sole purpose is to raise awareness. And what is this awareness we're trying to raise? We are trying to raise awareness to save the brain, whether it's to prevent a stroke or prevent the progression of Alzheimer's disease. We need to empower ourselves and each other to understand the causes of these diseases so we can prevent ourselves and people we love from having them. So let's talk about these different diseases. When we talk about all these different risk factors and how they contribute to these diseases, it's very interesting to understand that when we talk about the brain and the body actually in general, but we're going to focus on the brain today, there are many disease risk factors that we've all heard of, like high blood pressure, smoking, diet, all these types of things. But these risk factors, they don't lead to just individual diseases like stroke. They lead to multiple disease categories like Alzheimer's and stroke. So one risk factor, although we talk about risk factors that are specific for disease, risk factors can cause multiple diseases, and here's really the issue with the brain. The brain, we're going to talk about this in more detail, but the brain is a very metabolically active organ that really needs fuel to work, and it needs more fuel than the rest of the body. And the way it gets that fuel is through blood vessels, so your brain has to have healthy blood vessels. So anything that puts those blood vessels at risk not only increases your risk of stroke, but also increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So how does this all work? Well, let's start talking about inflammation. What is inflammation? Inflammation is the response of the immune system to injury or infection. And that sounds like usually a good thing. And it is, as long as it's a short-term process. However, if this becomes a long-term process, we call this chronic inflammation. This was a very interesting article published in Time magazine about 10 years ago entitled The Secret Killer. And in this article, they talk about how inflammation is really the root cause of heart attacks, cancer, and Alzheimer's disease. So right off the bat, one thing I want to talk to you about is seemingly different disease processes that we think of, like heart disease, heart attacks, cancer, and Alzheimer's disease, are actually all interrelated. They have the same common risk factors that cause them. And while that may sound like a bad thing, in one sense, it's a good thing, because if we find ways to prevent any one of these diseases, we're going to prevent all of them at the same time. So we're going to look at heart disease for a moment, because heart disease Stroke and Alzheimer's disease have many similarities. And the lessons we've learned from heart disease, we could apply to stroke and Alzheimer's disease. First off, they're all long-term diseases, all meaning stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and heart disease, meaning they take decades to occur typically. Heart disease, we typically think of as being caused by a handful of risk factors, the most significant of which include high blood pressure, high cholesterol, smoking, and being overweight. And we think about these different risk factors. Typically, we call these modifiable risk factors. Risk factors that we ourselves can modify. We could lower cholesterol, we could lower blood pressure, we could lower incidence of our chance of developing diabetes, we could increase our physical activity, things such as that. And it was the combination of these risk factors that we believe lead to the development of an arterial plaque or narrowing of blood vessels that would be so large that these plaques or narrowings would stop blood flow going to the heart, and that was theorized to be the cause of a heart attack. However, we find out later that more than half of all heart attacks occur in people with normal cholesterol levels. And people who unfortunately die from heart attacks, when we looked at their blood vessels under autopsy, we saw that the narrowing wasn't large enough to completely occlude blood flow to the heart. Further, people who went on cholesterol-lowering medications and reduced dietary fat in their diets, they continue to have heart disease progression. So something doesn't quite make sense here when these risk factors that are supposedly causing this disease don't really jive with the disease progression. So we start to realize that these risk factors only account for less than half of all the cases of heart disease. So there must be some other agent here causing heart disease, and we believe this now to be chronic inflammation. And how does this work? Well, here's a plaque here. Here's a picture of a plaque in an artery. And you can see that there's a clot that's emerged or ruptured from this plaque. We call this plaque an unstable plaque. And now we know that inflammation destabilizes these plaques. But look at this. This plaque by itself, it's not quite large enough to occlude this blood vessel. And this clot that emanates from this plaque is. But this clot only emanates from this plaque if it's unstable. And again, that's caused by inflammation. And that's what's blocking the blood flow to the heart, and that's what's causing this heart attack. And now we're seeing more and more and more in article after article that it's this inflammatory response that's really leading to plaque instability. And we see more and more articles appearing in the literature that contribute to this theory. So we talked about these modifiable risk factors like smoking and high blood pressure and high cholesterol. But there are also non-modifiable risk factors that are important too, such as your age, your gender, your risk, things like that. Same thing with stroke. Stroke has risk factors associated with it that increase the chances of having a stroke. So whether we're talking about stroke or heart disease and these modifiable risk factors, we have this handful of these modifiable risk factors like cholesterol and blood pressure and those types of things. But the key to all of this stuff is these risk factors, they increase inflammation in your body, oxidative stress, and AGEs, advanced glycation end products. And don't worry, we're going to talk about what all that means in more detail in a second. And many of these risk factors, such as high blood pressure, are proposed to be caused by inflammation. So when you take these risk factors and you couple them with inflammation or inflammatory markers, markers that demonstrate if you have inflammation in the body or not, these risk factors with inflammation are actually a stronger predictor of heart disease than the risk factors themselves. So the markers of inflammation, I meant to say, I misspoke. The markers of inflammation by themselves are stronger predictors of heart disease than these risk factors. So what's going on here? What's happening? Well, we know LDL, that's the bad cholesterol. Everyone's heard about this stuff. But what LDL actually does is it injures a blood vessel. That's right. So the inner lining of a blood vessel, it actually is injurious to that blood vessel. When that injury occurs, you have one of these immune cells, this is a macrophage, coming out to that LDL molecule and attacking it. And when it attacks it at the surface of that blood vessel, it causes a little plaque. And over time, that plaque continues to grow with more and more injury. And that plaque eventually will occlude this blood vessel. Now, what's very interesting is when that plaque occludes a blood vessel in the leg, we call that peripheral vascular disease. When that plaque occludes a blood vessel that goes through the heart, we call that a heart attack. And when that plaque occludes a blood vessel that goes to the brain, we call that a stroke. However, this is not three different disease processes in different parts of the body. It's the same disease process, whether it's leg, heart, or brain. This is atherosclerotic disease affecting blood vessels throughout your body. In a similar fashion, inflammation doesn't just cause cardiovascular disease throughout your body. It could cause cancer, it could cause neurologic diseases, arthritis, Alzheimer's, and so on and so on. And this is an important concept to understand because inflammation and the way your body works is the inflammatory cells in your body don't look at your brain as one organ and your heart as another and your legs and your arms as others. They see your body as a sea of molecules, and inflammation can occur anywhere. They look at this whole body equally. And to prove that out, the suffix itis is really Latin for inflammation. So you have inflammation of the joints, it's called arthritis. In the lungs, it's called bronchitis. In the heart, it's called carditis. In the brain, it's cerebritis. In the skin, it's dermatitis. In the stomach, it's gastritis. In the nerves, it's neuritis. And in blood vessels, it's called vasculitis. So really, this is inflammation occurring in different areas of the body, the same process, different names because of the different organs that are involved. This is a great example of this. This was a paper that was published almost 20 years ago now called A Tale of Two Diseases. And it looked at the similarities between atherosclerosis, that plaque formation in blood vessels, and a form of arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. And we're going to be talking about rheumatoid arthritis again a little bit when we talk about Alzheimer's disease. But what's very interesting is we found that the inflammatory mediators, these mediators that help orchestrate inflammation, were virtually identical between a disease that occurs in blood vessels, atherosclerosis, and a disease that occurs in the bone, arthritis. It's the same inflammatory mediators. Another thing that's very interesting is we're starting to realize that as we age, most Americans, long before they die, they have degenerative disease, meaning they have this disease state that we're unfortunately stricken with towards the end of our life, where we don't have normal functionality. But here's the kicker. This is what's very interesting is these changes, they don't occur when we get in our 50s and 60s and 70s. They occur in our 20s, and they progress in our 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. So it's imperative that we take steps necessary to prevent this disease from progressing this in our bodies and causing these degenerative states in our bodies. Let's talk about inflammation a little bit more. So periodontitis is inflammation of the teeth and gums. Why am I talking about inflammation of the teeth and gums? It's to illustrate a very important point. If you have periodontitis before you're age 35, again, inflammation of your teeth and gums, you have a five-fold increase of developing Alzheimer's disease. Five-fold increase in developing Alzheimer's disease if you have periodontitis or inflammation of your teeth and gums before age 35. And why is that? Because remember, those inflammatory mediators in your mouth, they go throughout your whole bloodstream into your brain. And those inflammatory mediators in your brain will kill brain cells. So this is a blood vessel in a mouse's brain. This is an inflammatory cell in that blood vessel in the mouse's brain. And here's an inflammatory cell that's come out of that blood vessel. And what's it going to do? It's activated. This is now an attack cell. It's like a little soldier that's going to go out and kill normal brain cells. And why is it going to do that? Because it's an inflammatory cell. And why am I showing this? Because this mouse had liver inflammation. So very interestingly, this mouse that has liver inflammation has an inflammatory response in the liver. Those inflammatory mediators circulate through the entire body, and these cells are actually released in the brain, attacking these brain cells. So very important to understand is inflammation is not disease specific. It doesn't cause just one disease, but it causes multiple diseases that seem to be unrelated, like arthritis and Alzheimer's and blood vessel disease. It's not body part specific. It affects the whole body, And here's the worst part about it. It's chronic and it's insidious. It affects your entire body silently. You don't know this is occurring because it's occurring slowly over time, and it's stripping you of your health. As depressing as that sounds, there is some good news, and we said this earlier, and that is, because this is not disease or body part specific, if we treat inflammation in one part of the body, we're actually treating inflammation everywhere. And a great example of this is anti-inflammatory agents that are used for rheumatoid arthritis. When people had arthritic pain, they've been taking anti-inflammatory medicine, such as ibuprofen. And that anti-inflammatory medicine, it not only relieves that arthritis, it also reduces the incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And we're going to talk about exactly why that is in a minute. But really, we know what inflammation is. What causes inflammation? Why is this even happening to us? Well, the biggest cause of inflammation is actually the foods we eat. So by picking foods that we eat, we could either pick foods that prevent inflammation, or we could pick foods that are inflammatory, and we have to start making better food choices. We're going to talk about that more in the second hour, but again, that's what's really causing inflammation. In a sense, we're slowly poisoning ourselves. Our society is slowly poisoning itself. Now, we talked about these modifiable risk factors earlier, like high blood pressure and physical inactivity. Well, every one of these risk factors is associated with an increase in inflammation, oxidative stress, and AGEs. And we're going to talk about those little processes here in a minute. Another thing we have to be worried about is something called homocysteine. Homocysteine is an amino acid associated with the consumption of meat in the diet. And homocysteine, in an independent pathway, also causes plaques to form. It also blocks blood vessels in the heart and the brain. And here you can see that the higher the levels of homocysteine in society are, the greater the mortality rate is from cerebrovascular diseases such as heart attacks and stroke. And look at the United States here. That's high in homocysteine incidence in our bloodstream versus these lower incidence countries. Another problem with homocysteine is it's directly neurotoxic. It kills brain cells, so that's not good. So what else does homocysteine do? It also causes narrowing of these arteries in your neck. These are your carotid arteries. These are the major vessels that supply blood to the front of your brain. And if you can't supply blood to your brain, guess what else you get? You get a stroke. So homocysteine is associated with elevated carotid artery stenosis. It's actually increased with carotid artery dissection also too, and stroke. So here's another disease process we've been talking about, oxidative stress. And what is oxidative stress? So oxidative stress occurs from an imbalance between the body's production of free radicals, we're going to talk about what a free radical is, and the ability of the body to detoxify them. Now, all of these processes, inflammation, free radicals, advanced glycation end products, they're all interrelated, meaning you can't have one without the other. And just like inflammation, free radicals play a key role in atherosclerotic disease, high blood pressure, stroke, diabetes, and heart failure. So we just said this, but really, if you think of the Three Stooges, when have you ever seen Larry, Curly, or Moe by themselves? It's the same thing with inflammation, oxidative stress, and AGEs. These cannot occur with each other. So whenever I talk about inflammation, assume oxidative stress and AGEs, advanced glycation end products, are nearby. The same thing with oxidative stress. Whenever I talk about Moe, think about these guys being nearby also. So what is a free radical? Free radical, we're going to talk about oxygen here, occurs when an oxygen molecule loses an electron. Now, when it loses this electron, we call this an unstable atom. And this unstable high energy atom, he's kind of like a bad guy. He's missing that electron. What he wants to do is grab that electron from another nearby atom. And if he does, he's going to make this atom unstable and sick, and this atom's going to die. Now, where do we get these free radicals from? We're going to talk this in more detail, but we can get exposure from radiation, from pollution, from stress, poor nutrition. And what happens? Free radicals, just like inflammation, cause all of these problems like cancer, aging, heart disease, diabetes. So when these cells are trying to steal electrons from each other, remember these cells make up molecules, and these molecules make up tissues, and these tissues make up organs. So what happens is when these atoms try to steal electrons from each other, they destroy the cell, which destroys tissue like brain tissue or blood vessel tissue or bone tissue, and it can cause things like stroke or plaque formation, blood vessels, or arthritis. So again, if you have a normal cell and it's exposed to free radicals, I'm going to talk about where these free radicals come from in a minute, you can have that cell die from what is called oxidative stress. A great example of that is an apple. If you peel an apple and put it on a kitchen counter, just take a bite out of it, you'll see that that golden white pulp will turn brown. That's free radical damage. Now, why isn't that apple turning brown when it's before you bite into it? That's because the most amount of antioxidants in that apple is in its skin. So that skin is a barrier to this oxidative stress or free radical damage. And by being a barrier to that free radical damage, it protects the inner contents of that apple. So again, we said there's all these other disease processes that are associated to free radical production, such as neurodegenerative disorders, arthritis, cancer. We're going to talk about this relationship more in a minute. But again, remember, oxidative stress or free radicals always occur in conjunction with inflammation and advanced glycation end products. So how are free radicals produced? Now, this is a little different than inflammation. There are a lot of things that can produce it. But remember, when we talk about inflammation, the primary source of inflammation is from external food sources. Now, the primary source of free radical production is actually from our own bodies. It's actually from mitochondria, which are our tiny little organelles in our cells that produce our energy. And what happens essentially is as we produce energy, we give off free radicals. What happens is as our mitochondria age, they become less efficient in producing energy and make more free radicals. And those free radicals actually damage the energy producing structures themselves that make them, the mitochondria. And a mitochondria I think of as like like a washing machine. Like when you get a washing machine, it works great at first, and after a while it starts banging around. That's kind of like a mitochondria, because as a mitochondria gets older and older and older, it makes more and more free radicals, which essentially destroy that mitochondria, damage and destroy it. And the day your mitochondria cannot make enough energy because of free radical damage, that's the day you die, because you need energy to live. And if your mitochondria can't make enough energy, you can't live. So we also know there's this inverse correlation between the levels of oxidative damage and mitochondrial DNA damage and our ability to live. So the more damage we have, mitochondrial DNA damage we have from free radicals, the shorter our lives are. And we know that animals, mammals specifically, that age slower and slower aging subcultures and populations, even in humans, they exhibit lower mitochondrial DNA damage than those species or human subcultures that age faster. Now, this correlation isn't the same with nuclear DNA. Now, interestingly, we know in Alzheimer's disease, there's an increase in mitochondrial DNA damage also. So what are antioxidants? You hear about these all the time. An antioxidant, remember we talk about that free radical, it's a bad guy because it steals electrons, it's missing an electron, wants to steal one from someone else. Now remember, when that free radical steals another electron, it makes that atom also a bad guy. An antioxidant is able to donate or give up one of these electrons without itself becoming unstable or a bad guy. And the reason that's so important is, remember, where free radicals are predominantly produced in our mitochondria. Mitochondria are everywhere we have cells. They're in the cells in our brain. That's where they make their energy. And if they damage that cell, they cause brain cell damage. So really, we want those antioxidants to prevent free radical formation everywhere we can. Again, remember, inflammation, free radicals, or oxidative stress, and AGEs, they all work together. They're all interconnected, and they're all interconnected in the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease, which we're going to be talking about here in a minute. So with that rather long background in these disease processes, we could finally start talking about the brain. So the brain is the most complex machine in the known universe. It has over 100 billion nerve cells, or neurons, or brain cells. It has over 1 trillion support cells, the glia, that help the neurons work. So your brain comprises your every thought, your every emotion, your every action, your every decision. It basically determines your personality, how you interact with people, your mood. It really determines everything about you. And the number of possible permutations and combinations of brain activity actually exceeds the number of elementary particles in the universe. And I know you're not going to believe this, but science has actually demonstrated now that your brain can actually influence particles in the universe, believe it or not. If you don't believe me, we'll have a video on that later. So the basic functioning cell in the brain is the brain cell, which we call the neuron. The neuron has a cell body, and it has this axon. And what it really basically does is it accepts and transmits information. So basically, your neurons just transmit information from one cell to another. So all neurons do is they just transmit information very rapidly. And it's rapid transformation, this rapid transportation of transferring information from one part of the brain to another part of the brain is what neuronal function is all about. It's the rapid transfer of information as quickly as possible. And these little units of transmission of information from one neuron to another, this is what makes you you. This is how you can think. Now, the problem with neurodegenerative diseases or disorders like Alzheimer's are we have neurons that are dying without recognizable reasons or causes. So these neurons in Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, for example, they die. And we don't know why they're dying. And these are age-associated. It's a chronic disease. These are progressive disease. And the worst part is there's no cure for these diseases. So we know neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease, are related to inflammation, free radicals, and AGEs. Alzheimer's disease was really diagnosed and determined in 1901 when a patient came to an insane asylum in Frankfurt, Germany, and she was found to have very noticeable pathology in her brain. But in addition to beta amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, which we're going to talk about in just one moment, she was also determined to have atherosclerotic disease in the large vessels of her brain. Remember, those plaques are caused by inflammation, oxidative stress, and AGEs. So there's a large amount of evidence that demonstrates atherosclerotic disease, or these plaque-stricken arteries in Alzheimer's disease, are correlated to plaque within blood vessels. Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, is the most common cause of dementia. It affects over 5 million Americans currently. It's doubled since 1980. By 2050, this number is projected to rise to 14 million, a threefold increase. It's expected to reach 67.7 million in 2030 and over 115 million by 2050. It affects all races and ethnic groups. It accounts for greater than $250 billion in annual costs in the United States alone. There is no cure or long-term effective treatment. So what do we see in the brain when someone has Alzheimer's disease? Well, we see something outside of the cells, that's what extracellular means, called amyloid plaques. And inside of the cells, we see something called neurofibrillary tangles, like these little tangles inside the brain cells themselves. But guess what else we see? We see inflammation, and we're going to talk about this in a moment. We see certain areas of the brain more damaged than others. For example, the hippocampus is a little structure in the brain. It looks like a little seahorse, and hippocampus is Greek for seahorse, that controls our memory. So within the cells, the brain cells of cells, we see these neurofibrillary tangles, which I'm just going to call tangles from now on. And outside the cell, we see these things called beta amyloid plaques, which I'm going to call plaque. But what's very interesting is in both of these areas, we see inflammation, oxidative stress, and AGEs. So this is very interesting. This is some original artwork done by Alzheimer when he discovered this disease. And these are drawings of these different neurofibrillary tangles within the brain cells. Now, this is what we call immunohistochemistry that allows us to immunologically look at beta amyloid plaque. This is a beta amyloid plaque, again, outside the blood, outside the brain cell, inside of the brain. And when you look at this, I always ask people what, when I lecture live on this subject, what do they think of this when they see this? And almost everyone says fire. And what's very interesting about that is fire is the word inflammation is derived from, the term inflammation is derived from. And inflammation, again, it just shows you how this is an inflammatory response. This looks like an inferno. This essentially is a beta amyloid plaque from the brain. Now, these plaques, by the way, the inflammatory mediators associated with them, guess what, are very similar to the same ones we saw in that tale of two diseases. We looked at inflammation of blood vessels, atherosclerotic disease, and inflammation of bones, rheumatoid arthritis. They're the same, also the same inflammatory mediators. And again, inflammation, oxidative stress, and AGEs, remember the three stooges? They all occur together in these beta amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. They also occur in Lewy bodies, which occur in Parkinson's disease, and Huntington fragments, which also occur in Huntington's disease. The biggest issue with Alzheimer's disease is by the time it's diagnosed, it's end-stage disease, and it's too late to really reverse this disease process. So really the key is to make these changes, prevent the disease before it's too late. Remember, we talked about this earlier, that most Americans late in their life, they have degenerative disease, but they start accumulating that disease in their 20s. So really, in the case of Alzheimer's disease, we're having changes in our brain. What changes? We're having beta amyloid plaque and neurofibrillary tangles actually occurring in our 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, and they accumulate over time. And over time, when they accumulate to be too great, it's too late to stop the progression of the disease. And why is that? Well, what happens is, as this different pathology accumulates in the brain, those plaques and tangles, they make the disease worse. And it's a positive feedback cycle. What happens is you get death and destruction of these neurons. And remember, these neurons are transmitting information. If they can't transfer that information, you no longer can think properly, perform the skills you once normally could. And what happens is, as these cells die, they cause more inflammatory mediators to be released. And the more they die, the worse this inflammatory cycle becomes, causing more death and destruction to neurons or brain cells. Now, what's very interesting about this inflammation, free radicals, and AGEs, as we notice, they are in the highest concentrations in the areas of the brain that are most affected by Alzheimer's disease, like the frontal lobe, the areas of the brain that are involved with memory, and the areas of the brain that are involved with language. And again, Alzheimer's disease is unstaged disease. So when those brain cells are destroyed, they shrink the tissue. So look at this healthy brain here, and look at the memory and language centers for Alzheimer's disease, for example. You see how these structures look like they're shrunken down? That's because the brain cell death within these areas of the brain that control language and memory are very prevalent, causing these areas of the brain to shrink down. Another big problem with Alzheimer's disease is we're noticing other disease processes, such as stroke, for example, are diminishing. For example, stroke in the last few years has gone from the number 3 cause of death to the number 5 cause of death. But look at Alzheimer's. The numbers of deaths from Alzheimer's disease continue to increase. And in this situation, up to almost 50%. And we have to talk about that as a society. Why is that happening? Well, one reason this is happening is Alzheimer's disease, the risk of it continues to increase higher and higher and higher, as does its incidence. Why is that? Well, look where we are here. This is a timetable that shows our aging population in the United States. Now, our biggest population is the baby boomers. We're getting close to 2020 right now, in 2017. We're right in the middle of this curve, or this rapid inclination of an aging population. So this is the highest point in history. We have more 65-year-old people than ever before in United States history. this is really a senior ticking time bomb occurring if these people are going to develop Alzheimer's disease at the rate we project them to. So what can we do? Well, we don't know what causes Alzheimer's disease. There's no cure, but we know how to delay its onset. And by delaying the onset of Alzheimer's disease, that's where our hope lies. That's where we know we can reduce the incidence of Alzheimer's disease just by delaying its onset. Very interestingly, these areas of the brain that are affected by Alzheimer's disease that are shrunken down, they have very high concentration of these inflammatory mediators. And these high concentrations of these inflammatory mediators, again, are related to those that cell death cycle we talked about. Now, earlier we talked about people who were taking different anti-inflammatory drugs for things like rheumatoid arthritis had a sharp reduction of these inflammatory mediators in the areas of the brain affected by Alzheimer's disease. And there's many studies, over 20 so far, that show a marked decrease in Alzheimer's disease in people taking anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen. And even more important than that, this light blue here is a general population representation of someone not taking any anti-inflammatory agents. But more important than what we just said is, if you take anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen or Advil, the more you take, the more your risk of or incidence of Alzheimer's disease is reduced. So there's a direct correlation to the amount of anti-inflammatory drug you're taking and your reduction in Alzheimer's disease. So what we're really talking about here is, again, preventing Alzheimer's disease from occurring. That's really what our goal is. We want to prevent the disease from occurring. And how do we prevent that? Well, we know Alzheimer's disease is associated with inflammation, oxidation, and advanced glycation end products. So we want to block all three of those. We also want to block homocysteine. Remember, that causes bad things to happen. We want to stabilize mitochondrial decay, because remember, mitochondrial decay, it leads to aging and disease. And again, we want to stop the progression of this disease prior to end-stage disease, because remember, end-stage disease is too late. So by delaying the onset of Alzheimer's disease, we're preventing the disease, and it's the prevention that's the cure of this disease. So remember, once Alzheimer's disease is typically diagnosed, it's end-stage disease. It's too late. So we need to focus on prevention on the early stages of this disease. So why don't we just all take ibuprofen and aspirin, right? If that reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease, let's just take that. We should be fine, right? Well, it's not quite that simple, because in addition to blocking enzymes that cause the disease or that are related to these inflammatory markers, NSAIDs, drugs like Advil and ibuprofen, also block normal enzymes and normal functioning structures in your body called prostaglandins, mediators in your body. And these mediators actually prevent our stomach. That's why if you take something like ibuprofen, you're always asked to take it on a full stomach, not to take it on an empty stomach, because it could cause ulceration. It could also cause liver and kidney toxicity. In fact, the risk of dying from GI bleeding from taking NSAIDs is almost as high as dying from HIV. It's kind of crazy, but that's what it is. So when we look at or revisit our goals for treatment or prevention of Alzheimer's disease and stroke, we want something that is anti-inflammatory, but we don't want the harmful side effects of these NSAIDs. We still want an antioxidant. We still want an anti-AGE. We still want to block homocysteine, mitochondrial decay. Again, we want to stop the progression of the disease before it's too late. And by doing that, we're going to delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease, and that delay, that onset, will lower the incidence. Again, prevention is the cure. So one thing that's been popping up in the literature quite a bit lately are these newer, or I should say newer spices, these spices that have existed for thousands of years that we in Western medicine have just discovered recently, fairly recently. One of these is turmeric. Turmeric is been used in Chinese and Indian medicine for 5,000 years. Its active ingredient is called curcumin. And this golden powder that you see here for turmeric or curcumin is what they make chicken curry out of, and tandoori chicken, all that kind of stuff. But the bottom line is turmeric and its active ingredient curcumin have anti-carcinogenic properties. Yep, that's right. Anti-cancer properties, antioxidant properties, and anti-inflammatory properties. So I'm going to tell you right now, if there's any one thing you can learn from this lecture, if you ignore everything else I tell you, make sure you somehow start taking some form of curcumin in your diet, where you take it orally or a supplement. And however you want to take it, just take it. And that's the one thing I'm going to leave you with this lecture. If you learn nothing else from this lecture, make sure you take curcumin on a daily basis. So we see in these are blood vessels in a mouse brain, and these are plaque. Remember that beta amyloid plaque we talked about? We know that curcumin, this is that beta amyloid plaque labeled in these brains here. We know that curcumin is actually associated with a 4-fold less risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in India, where people consume this on a daily basis, probably every single meal, than compared to the United States. Now, some people could say, well, you know, Indians are vegetarians. They don't eat as much meat. They're not as fat as we are. Well, that could be true. So what we also have is we have these transgenic animal models. And when I say transgenic, what do I mean by this? This mouse was actually genetically modified just to develop beta amyloid plaque in its brain. That's what we're looking at here, okay? So what's very interesting about this mouse model is on the top row is beta amyloid plaque. On the bottom row, we have a mouse brain with much less beta amyloid plaque. So here's the top row with beta amyloid plaque. Here's the bottom row with much less beta amyloid plaque. And what are we looking at? What's happening here? Well, the top is a control group where they were just fed a normal diet and they developed this beta amyloid plaque as these transgenic animals were destined to. On the bottom row, this mouse, or these mice in this group, were fed curcumin. And they have about 90% less, probably more than less than 90% production of curcumin compared to the control group. What's very interesting about that is when you look at this study where we looked at twin studies, and we noticed that one twin took ibuprofen to prevent arthritis, or to treat arthritis, they had a 75% reduction in the development of Alzheimer's disease just by taking an anti-inflammatory drug. In these twin studies, where we're going to go back here, where these mice were fed curcumin, they found that this curcumin worked better than ibuprofen. Why? Because it was not just an anti-inflammatory drug, it was an antioxidant also. And if this worked better than ibuprofen because it's an antioxidant, in addition to being an anti-inflammatory agent, that's great. But what's even better news is there's no side effects to this. Remember we talked about ibuprofen and aspirin, these other NSAIDs could cause GI, kidney, and liver problems? Well, guess what? Curcumin has none of those side effects, and it works better. So in these twin studies, if ibuprofen reduced the risk, the incidence of Alzheimer's disease by about 75% and it delayed its onset by about 10 years, curcumin should work better than that. And it's now being studied for that exact reason. This is a human cell culture. These are beta amyloid plaque without, and on the right with curcumin added. And you can see that after curcumin is added, our own macrophages in our body, immune cells, will basically gobble up that beta amyloid plaque. So what does curcumin really do? Well, one thing we know curcumin does, it's a potent blocker of something called nuclear transcription factor kappa beta. That's a lot of Greek letters, but basically nuclear transcription factor kappa beta is regarded as the central regulator of inflammation. So by blocking nuclear transcription factor kappa beta, curcumin is blocking inflammation. And it's not just blocking it in the brain for Alzheimer's. It's blocking in blood vessels for cardiovascular disease. It's blocking in cancer cells to prevent cancer, and bone to prevent arthritis. Curcumin, because it inhibits nuclear transcription factor kappa beta, and because it has low side effects and it blocks inflammation as a whole everywhere, many researchers are saying, making comments like this: because of its low side effect profile and long history of safe use, curcumin may find clinical application for Alzheimer's disease prevention and stroke prevention and heart disease prevention. Look at all the stuff curcumin does. You know, it prevents the inflammation associated with multiple sclerosis too. Anywhere you have inflammation in the body, curcumin can potentially prevent it or prevent that disease from occurring and treat it also. One problem with curcumin, though, is it has very poor bioavailability. What do I mean by that? I mean, for you to have effective doses of curcumin, you have to eat about 4 grams of it a day. I don't think people are going to take a 4-gram pill every day, but if you couple curcumin with different agents, and if you take curcumin as the supplement, make sure you're taking with an agent that increases its bioavailability. So we could increase the bioavailability by curcumin by 2,000-fold, where you only have to take a little bit of it a day. So moving right along, I'm going to skip this one part. This is a little past what we need to do here. What makes curcumin act the way it does? Well, curcumin is a polyphenol, okay? What is a polyphenol? It's an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory agent found in nature, plant sources. And you've heard of these because aspirin is a polyphenol, but instead of having just one of these polyphenolic groups, curcumin has 2 of them. It's like polyphenols on steroids. And by the way, John Vane in 1982 won the Nobel Prize by demonstrating aspirin is an anti-inflammatory agent. So these polyphenol compounds block inflammation. When aspirin blocks inflammation, it blocks heart attacks, and it affords protection against cancer. Again, it's a polyphenolic compound. When aspirin was first used, it was made from willow tree bark, which was all natural. When it was synthesized into acetylsalicylic acid, or aspirin, it had side effects, and it was synthesized, so it was cheaper to make. But before it was synthesized, before it was synthetic, and it was just derived from willow tree bark, it had no side effects. So if you want to take aspirin and have none of the side effects, just take it naturally from willow tree bark. Now, in addition to aspirin and curcumin, there are also other polyphenols, and you've probably heard of these, like grapeseed extract, or resveratrol in red wine, or ECGC, which is a polyphenol compound in green tea. And these polyphenols, again, they're not just good antioxidants, but they're good anti-inflammatory agents also. So it's the combination of being an anti-inflammatory agent and antioxidant that gives these things their special powers. And in Alzheimer's disease and in stroke, what they really are doing is they block plaque toxicity. They block plaque formation. They block pro-inflammatory mediators. They're basically neuroprotective. In stroke, what they do is they increase red cell blood cell pliability. They decrease blood viscosity, or the ability for blood to become sticky and cause clot. They increase our own fibrinolytic activity. That's just a fancy doctor word that tells us polyphenol allows us to dissolve clot better in our body. They improve blood flow and oxygenation to ischemic areas of the brain. They block platelet formation. And by the way, not platelet formation, but platelet aggregation. So a lot of people are anti-platelet medicines, but you know what's a really great anti-platelet medicine is any fruit or vegetable, essentially. What's interesting is they did, this was another epidemiologic study that showed regular polyphenol consumption, and this one was called quercetin, which is found mostly in tea and apples, reduced the incidence of stroke in one population by 73%. By 73%. So again, it shows you how powerful these polyphenols are. When I think of these guys, I think of them as the fruit of the loom guys. Like, here's grapeseed extract, here's the grape guy. Apples, we just talked about that study, has curcumin in it, and on and on and on. By the way, another powerful polyphenol is the polyphenols found in green tea, EGCG. And this has also an additional property that, in addition to being a polyphenolic compound that is an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory agent, it also contributes to brain cell plasticity, meaning it allows you to repair and regenerate new brain cells, which very few things in our medical universe do. So if you don't drink green tea already, make sure you drink it. So what are these polyphenols do? They're neuroprotective, okay? They're anti-inflammatory, they're anti-lipemic, meaning they reduce LDL. They're antioxidants and they block AGEs also. And these multiple properties of polyphenols is what give them these wonderful traits that allow them to reduce heart disease. This is proven in the medical literature. To reduce stroke, proven in the medical literature. And I have an asterisk with Alzheimer's disease because this has only been shown in animal models at this point. But trials are being done in humans right now. So really, when we talk about these polyphenols, these incredible anti-inflammatory antioxidant agents, they have to be given early before end stage. They prevent or delay disease onset. End stage disease is so late, so consume these now, okay? Now, antioxidants in Alzheimer's, we deferred to this a little while ago, but the brain is particularly vulnerable to free radical damage. And the reason that's so important is, the brain has a very high content of polyunsaturated fatty acids, okay? And these are very sensitive to free radicals. The brain only comprises 2% of the body's weight, but it consumes about 20 to 25% of the body's energy requirements. So think about it. Your brain cells, the mitochondria in your brain cells, are producing a ton of energy. It's kind of like a high revving sports car engine, okay? But instead of replacing that engine with lots and lots of oil, we have to make sure those cells are undamaged. So this high metabolic rate is associated with reduction of more free radicals. But what makes this even worse is the brain has very poor antioxidant concentrations compared to other organs. And when we talk about that free radical damage can injure atoms, that can injure cells and tissues, this is exactly what happens in the brain, and this is what destroys brain cells. In fact, when we look at the free radical production in people with Alzheimer's disease, it's much higher than in people that don't have it. Conversely, in people with Alzheimer's disease, they have much, much lower concentrations of antioxidants such as vitamin C compared to people who don't have it. So really, it's important that people who want to prevent getting Alzheimer's disease, which I think is everyone, need to consume more and more antioxidants. And this is a great study that showed people who drank fruit juice or vegetable juice more than 3 times a week, not a day, more than 3 times a week, had a 76% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. By the way, this study was done in Japanese American adults age 65 or older. I talk to, when I give lectures a lot of people tell me, well, it's too old for me. It's not too old for you. It's not too late for you. It's never too late. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you don't have a disease, you're young enough to prevent it. As long as you're not diagnosed with that disease, it's end-stage disease, it's never too late. So again, goals for treatment. We want anti-inflammatory agents. We know what they are. They're these polyphenolic compounds. Guess what? Those polyphenolic compounds are also antioxidants. They're also anti-AGEs. But we also want something that will prevent homocysteine, that bad amino acid forming in our blood, and something that will also prevent mitochondrial decay. Again, we want to stop the disease like stroke or Alzheimer's before it's too late. Remember, we want to delay that onset. Prevention is the cure. So we said this already. These polyphenols are neuroprotective, they're anti-inflammatory, anti-lipemic, they're antioxidants, and they also block AGEs. We showed they reduce heart disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's in animal models. But again, they have to be given before it's too late, before end stage. For a homocysteine, we know folic acid, B12, and vitamin B6 normalize homocysteine levels in the body. For mitochondrial decay, there's 2 agents that are very good, alpha-lipoic acid and coenzyme Q10. They both inhibit mitochondrial decay. Pyridoxal 5-phosphate, which is an active form of vitamin B6, also blocks AGEs. In the next lecture, the next hour, we're going to focus more on nutrient therapy. But really, all of these AGEs, inflammation, and oxidative stress are blocked by these polyphenolic compounds, and some are blocked by other substances, which we'll talk about more in the next lecture. The thing that's very interesting about nutrient therapy is it's better than using these over-the-counter NSAIDs, because you have some suppression of inflammation and you have suppression of oxidative stress. It's not one thing they're working on multiple pathways. And they're safer too, because you don't have any GI, liver, or kidney toxicity than when compared to drugs like ibuprofen. And when we use these with other antioxidants synergistically, like vitamin C, vitamin E, and alpha lipoic acid, the synergistic effects of these polyphenolic compounds with these antioxidants is very, very strong. So there was quite a lot of information in this lecture. I think this is a good place to take a break. Before I do, just a couple things. The next lecture, again, we said this earlier, is going to talk about the specific nutritional therapy we can do to prevent stroke and Alzheimer's. This lecture was more about what causes these disease processes, what's related to their disease progression, and how can we combat the disease from occurring. I know there's a lot of information in this lecture. The last thing I was going to say, as with any other lecture I ever do, if you have any questions at all, please email me. My email is strokenerd, that's S-T-R-O-K-E, nerd, N-E-R-D, no space, @gmail.com. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you at our next lecture.